Okay, hello and welcome to the latest edition of the GAA Handball Youth Expo 2021. Delighted to say we have a very special guest on the line today, formerly one of Ireland's leading elite athletes and now a sports psychologist with the Institute of Sport, Jessie Barr. Jessie, thanks very much for giving up your time this morning.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Glad to be here.
And I hope you're keeping well during lockdown.
Yeah, I say be here from obviously the comfort of my home office, as we've all gotten used to. Yeah, look, at this stage, we've been in lockdown for nearly a year now. So, yeah, I'm just used to it. I think like everyone, I think we've all kind of had our peaks and troughs, and I'm just getting on with it and doing what I can with the circumstances. So, I'm not saying it's not challenging. Those days I find it harder than others, but I'm just doing what I can, doing the best I can every day.
We're here today, Jessie, I suppose, to talk about coping with lockdown and maybe be able to give our young people some different mechanisms and ideas for that. But maybe just to start off with, to introduce yourself a little bit. So obviously your background is in athletics and you competed at the very elite end in Ireland and internationally, the European level and so on. And you stepped away from that then and you've gone into sports psychology. And I know you were saying off air that you're currently studying for a PhD as well. So maybe just to talk about the life of an athlete. I know that elite athletes lead a very structured life. When you step away from that, that's going to obviously pose challenges. So how have you adjusted to that?
Yeah, it was a big adjustment. It was a decision that was about 2 years in the making, which would kind of suggest how big an adjustment it is. I am lucky that I've always been a student athlete. So I've always been studying. As you said, I am doing a PhD, which was ongoing towards the end of my career. So I've always had something going on that I knew once I stepped away from the track, I would have a new kind of path formed for myself. So it did make it easier. But I suppose the hardest thing was letting go of that kind of athlete identity and what I was competing at, on Irish teams from about 16 years old until I was 28 or 29. Well, 28 is when I properly stepped away. And yeah, it was the kind of letting go of being Jessie the athlete and being who I identified myself as, but also how I was also identified by other people. If I was to meet someone, that I hadn't seen in a while, the first questions were always, how's training going? When's your next race? How are the injuries? When all this? So when that stopped, it was like, what do I have left to talk about? What else do I have going on? And you have that kind of feeling of like, God, do I have anything else going on? And of course I did. I was doing a PhD, studying, there's always stuff going on, but I had that big part of myself that was gone. And, the hardest thing was letting go of not just that identity, but it was the thing that I really loved doing. I loved it because I was good at it. It was kind of what gave me my confidence. It's what motivated me and gave me structure every day, like you said. So yeah, it was a really big adjustment. And like I said, I was very lucky to have a career path already kind of being formed towards the end of my career as a sports psychologist. And when I eventually stepped away, I was working as a sports psychologist at the Sport Ireland Institute. So I had something to step straight into, which definitely made it easier. I know for athletes who don't have a career path or a plan for after, definitely struggle that bit more. But I suppose no matter how well you plan it, you are letting go of a big part of your life. And that's always a challenge anyway.
And I suppose it's something we often hear, that athletes shouldn't wrap their entire identity up in the sports person. So Jessie Barr, the sports person, shouldn't be Jessie Barr, the person. So was that something you were guilty of in your own career? Just listening to you there, something that maybe just occurred to me.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely guilty of it. It was, everything came after athletics. All my decisions were made based on how it would affect training, how it would affect racing. And that's the way it had to be. I was competing at that level, that it was my number one priority. So, everything I did during the day had to be considered how it might affect training or how tired it would make me, or could this work around the plan for the weekend's race. So yeah, sometimes things like study definitely did suffer. I'm not going to lie. There's a reason I'm still doing a PhD, even though I started it in 2015. So things definitely suffered as a result. But yeah, it's definitely something looking back, I didn't have as much of a balance as maybe as I could have all the time. But at the same time, it's very difficult because to be an elite athlete, the focus and priority does have to be on your sport. So, I think at different times of the year, that priority obviously shifts. So, I'm working with a lot of athletes who are working towards their leaving cert or maybe college exams. So that time of the year, the shift might favor a bit more towards their studies. But yeah, first and foremost, I was always an athlete. And I did have other stuff going on, but maybe I didn't recognize it as much until I was finished, people didn't.
Yeah, as you say, like to compete at that level, athletics has to come first. But I know the late Jerry Kieran was always banging the drum for athletes and saying to people, you don't realize how hard these people train, and maybe don't get the same acclaim as even, say, GAA stars. I know that was a bugbear of his. So just outline, and it was very enjoyable listening to him. It's such a loss. Great. I'm sure you feel a lot better more than anyone else. But just outline maybe the sort of training that an elite athlete does as a runner in Ireland at the level you were at.
Yeah, so my event was the 400-meter hurdles. So I was a sprinter technically, even though it's one full lap of the track. You're running for a minute. You're not quite sprinting full out for the whole minute, but we were considered in the sprints. So if you were to speak to a distance runner, they'd laugh at our training and say, what, that's easy. You spend most of your time sitting down recovering for the next race. A lot of what, sprinting is trying to get your body to work at a high intensity, high explosive, high power. So a lot of your training was involved in getting your body ready for it and recovering for the next maybe repetition of a run, for example. So I would have done, I think we did three track sessions. One of those would have been a technical session with hurdles or blocks. One would have been more speed focused, depending on the time of year as well. So say in the winter, it would have been kind of speed and speed endurance, or it could have been speed endurance and endurance, which I hated. Anything over 400 meters, I really didn't like it. So obviously in the winter, you're trying to build up that fitness base and that aerobic base to be able to for rounds in the summer, rounds of races and stuff. So you do kind of 3 track sessions. There would have been 2 strength and conditioning sessions in the gym, which I loved because it was something different. It was a new challenge, and it was something you're always improving in, because obviously the speed endurance and the speed sessions on the track were not that different over the years. So the gym provided something new, and something new to challenge yourself, which was great. And myself and my brother Thomas used to be very competitive in the gym, even though he was obviously much stronger. We did circuit sessions for just general kind of physical conditioning, which were good. They were challenging and different. Some plyometrics, which would be those kind of hops and bounds and jumps over hurdles, just to kind of increase that kind of elastic strength. And then in the winter, there would have been hill running on a Saturday or Sunday morning out in the 𝗵𝗏 Woods in County Clare. So that was always fun. That was the slog. But it was fun again because it was different. I kind of loved the sessions that were a little bit different. I loved running over the hurdles, or stuff that wasn't just a straight running. So yeah, we would have trained 6 days a week. And I think at least 3, if not 4 of those would have been double sessions, double days.
Okay.
The max we would have trained in a day would have been 3 hours. We weren't training all day. People hear that you're training twice a day, but it could be an hour session in the morning and an hour and a half in the evening or something. So, you wouldn't be spending a lot of time, but the time you're spending is quite less, or training is quite high intensity. So there was a lot of recovery, lots of naps.
I've spoken to Katrina McKernan before. I'm from Cavan myself. So
okay.
I've interviewed her a few times, but she talked about how difficult she found it stepping away, and she likened it to a drug. She actually still competes in 5Ks and stuff like that, and road races, because she just has to get that buzz of running. But it got me thinking about, if it's a drug, then there's going to be withdrawal symptoms, and that got me thinking about the parallels with lockdown. Because if you're competing to that level, or even in handball, and we're going to focus on handball here, you're putting that many hours into it and so on, and you're striving and you've got targets. So is it that sense that with you having stepped away from the track, can you see parallels with lockdown, where people have been forced to step away from their sports?
100%, yeah. And it's something that, myself and the rest of the psychology team have weekly meetings recently, just to kind of support each other, because we are finding that all those challenges are kind of coming our way from athletes. They're kind of bringing all of their stresses and their struggles. And I suppose one thing that's interesting is that, you think about, if you talk to even all the handball athletes, what is it that they love about their sport? It's probably the competition. It's getting to go away to to, you know, go away to play matches, to travel abroad. It's meeting new people. It's probably not the day-to-day slog of training that is their probably number one passion for it. It's probably important, but the passion is probably in the competition, improving my skills, meeting new people, getting to challenge myself. And the difficulty of lockdown is all of those things are the things that are taken away from us at the moment. So all you're left with is the hard slog. It's the stuff you can do at home. It's the conditioning. It's the stuff and taking the social aspect as well, because they're used to playing as a team and now suddenly everyone's trying to train at home as an individual. And it was probably quite similar to when I stepped away from the track, that the things that I loved were the things I couldn't do. Like I could always go to the track and go for a jog or go for a run or put on my spikes, but I wasn't going to be lining up behind the blocks anymore, or I wasn't going to get to travel as part of a team, and all of the kind of the best things that come with that, and putting yourself, knowing you've trained really hard and putting yourself in that competitive environment to challenge yourself, that was taken away. And I suppose that's what lockdown has kind of done to us as well. It's taken the elements that make the slog worth it are kind of gone. So yeah, it's a really challenging time. And I suppose for athletes who are still in that position, which most are, is to remember why you're doing it. Like, because this is not going to last forever. You know, I'm unfortunately never going to go back to competitive athletics. It's not in me. Not at the level I was anyway, obviously. And I've had to accept that, like, that's not going to come back, but lockdown will end. You know, this is not going to be forever. And remember why you're doing that hard slog, and kind of try to remember that, okay, I haven't competed, I haven't played a match in so long, but there will be matches again. And how do I want to be when eventually I get back to playing a match? Do I want to be completely unfit? And do I want to have wasted this year? So yeah, it's an interesting parallel to draw, but it does, there's a lot of parallels for sure in the lockdown situation that we're in.
You kind of answered my next question, Jessie, which is so thanks for that. But what are the common problems that sports people are facing in the lockdown? Obviously, you're talking to athletes day to day. What are the problems that are presenting themselves?
Yeah, I suppose other than that kind of that feeling, because obviously I'm working with a lot of elite athletes who are now getting the opportunity to train. So that hasn't been an issue for them since before Christmas as much. But probably the biggest thing is the uncertainty. You know, I'm working with athletes who are not qualified yet for Tokyo, who are on the Tokyo, like who should be qualified for Tokyo, but they haven't had a qualification event because their races or their matches or their games or their competitions keep getting cancelled. So they keep preparing themselves for something to only be told it's not going ahead. So that uncertainty is really, really challenging, because it's kind of chipping away at athletes' motivation to train at that high level that's required when you're in competition season. Because they're kind of thinking, what's the point? If I keep training at this level, they're just going to cancel it anyway. So I'm probably not going to be, probably don't need to be this fit yet. You know, what's the point? You know, and even for athletes who are paid, this is their day-to-day job, even they're feeling that, like, what is the point of me putting this hard slog in when I'm going to get nothing out of it? So that uncertainty has been really challenging. And that feeling that the uncertainty, with that uncertainty, is that kind of lack of control, that we don't have control over what's going on, that feeling that, like, it's been taken away. Someone else is deciding our fate, you know, so that's been really challenging. You know, Tokyo, unlike last year when, you know, by kind of the end of March, we knew Tokyo wasn't going ahead. So then it was just a case of just, let's get through this year with no competitions and then see how we are next year. Now it's like, we've no competitions, but we may have the biggest competition of our life in late July, early August. So how do we get our head around that? And that's been a huge new challenge. And look, it's challenging. I'm working with athletes at all levels. It's not just athletes bound for Tokyo. I'm working with, you know, the Watford Camogie, the under 16s or the minors, you know, and all their events have been cancelled as well. And they're losing motivation. And then they're trying to balance this challenge of, you know, a leaving cert, which is uncertain, with a sports season, which is uncertain. So they're trying to prepare for all these things. So yeah, it's that uncertainty that I definitely think has thrown up the most challenges across the board. And I don't think that's just for athletes. I'm sure you probably felt it yourself, but it is with athletes. This is the thing that they're finding really, really hard to get their head around. And there's only so much you can do. It's a case, unfortunately, of learning to kind of accept that this is an uncertain time. No one can do much about it. And we just have to kind of go with the flow, which is just getting harder and harder as obviously the summer is getting closer.
And you mentioned the Waterford under 16 and minor camogie girls. Is it particularly difficult for adolescents or people, would say, in their late teens? Because you mentioned leaving cert and obviously Debs and all these sort of rites of passage that they've lost out on the last 12 months and their sport as well. Do you think that age group is finding it particularly hard?
Yeah, I think so. I think just, the additional stress of having to do school from home. And I really feel for people as well in, the early years of college. I'm working with athletes who have never really been in a proper lecture, because they've never, maybe some of them are doing college from home or they're living on campus, but not getting to enjoy that college experience. So for that age group in the kind of mid to late teens is really tough. Like I have a cousin who's doing her leaving cert. Now she's delighted, I think, that she doesn't have to sit exams, that the option is there. But, even small things like she plays soccer and she can't go and see all her friends. She'd be a really social girl. She loves to see people every week, and having to only see people online was really, really challenging. And even like she's doing wanting to do her driving test and she can't. Yeah. It's little things. It's the kind of small things that you forget about that are holding them back, and the experiences that they're having that is so different. So the leaving cert has been a really big challenge for athletes at that age. So there's just so many sources of uncertainty. It would nearly be okay if you only had the sport as your uncertainty, but then you go into school and that's uncertain. There's no kind of source of security to kind of ground them at the moment, which is really challenging.
So you've outlined in great detail there the various challenges facing athletes. But what coping mechanisms can they employ? That's what we're hopefully you're going to be able to impart some wisdom to.
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There is some things. Look, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. It's not going to be stuff they've never heard of, but sometimes hearing it from someone else. So I suppose in terms of uncertainty, it's focusing on what you can control. Because like I said, with uncertainty, it comes that lack of control and that feeling that I don't know what's going on. So instead of, thinking about all the things that are uncertain and that we can't control that are causing us stress, which is probably those are the things that are causing us the most stress, is the things we can't control. It's focusing on what can I do day to day that I can control, that I can progress in. So, even if you're to bring it down to the basics, making sure I'm getting a good night's sleep, making sure that my nutrition is good, making sure that whatever training I've been told to do, I'm doing. I'm keeping myself fit and healthy, so that when I eventually do get back to training, I'm in one piece, that I'm not kind of having to start from scratch again. Focusing, and as well as those kind of things, the things you can control are like your mindset. Do you have a positive or kind of a negative attitude to this whole situation? And I think we kind of all flitter between the two, I think, whether it's this is so unfair, why is this happening? Or everyone's facing the same challenges. I'm just going to get on with it the best I can. And, depending on the day, you probably feel one or the other, but recognizing that's a choice that you have, how you decide to perceive it, how you decide to perceive the situation. Is it something that's a huge challenge that I'm going to learn from? Or is it something that's just really unfair and I'm just fed up with it and I'm not going to try anymore? That's a choice. And it's a difficult choice, every day, when every day is the same and there's that feeling of Groundhog Day and all the things we love we're not getting to go ahead with. Recognizing that there's a nice metaphor that I've heard is not that we're all in the same boat, but that we're all facing the same storm. We're all in different boats because everyone is facing different challenges. But overall, this is probably the first time we're kind of united against one challenge, but just we're all facing it from different kind of points of view. So if you can kind of see it from that, is that like, this is a time that I can learn, to develop some resilience, which is just that kind of ability to cope with challenges and come back better. So, when 2021 finally ends and all of this is behind us, what can I look back on and think, I got that from this time, or I learned this about myself, or I was able to see this as a positive. Could be just a chance to kind of slow the pace a bit, for example. Another thing I've been recommending is having a good daily routine, because that's, again, in our control. What we choose to do on just a day-to-day basis. So like our sleep routine, what time we go to bed and wake up. Our routine, say my morning routine will always involve walking my dog, maybe getting a coffee. There's a little coffee shop, like so many coffee shops are opening up locally at the moment. Little coffee shop opened up, so I'd often go for a walk, grab a coffee before I start work. That's my little kind of morning routine, and that kind of grounds me, sets me up for the day. What time, getting your training in developing that just daily routine that you know what's coming at least tomorrow. We don't know what's coming next week or next month or over the summer, but at least I know what I'm going to do and what I have to get done tomorrow. And I think that's that feeling of creating some certainty in an uncertain time. Having that routine can be really, really important. And then just reaching out to people, that social support. You know, I think actually just sharing how you're feeling. I think when I'm speaking to athletes, they're always surprised. You know, they kind of come on and say, God, I'm just finding it really hard. And I know I shouldn't be, but I'm really struggling with motivation. And when I tell them, you're the third person I've spoken to today who's had a similar feeling, they're really surprised because no one's really sharing those feelings because everyone assumes that everyone else is coping better. So I think just talking to people is really important too.
And in terms of routine, just to touch on that again, even outside of lockdown, like how important is structure as a pillar of preparation for athletes? I know that in handball, maybe some of our players would have a highly structured regime. Some of them would have dedicated coaches. Some of our players mightn't have coaches in handball. They might be just going to the court, entering competitions, and maybe being driven around by parents and so on. So maybe that could be unique to our sport. But how important is it to have a structure, to have training diaries, to know what you were doing last Wednesday and what you're doing next Wednesday and so on?
I think it is important because then you can prepare. You know, our brains cope best when we know what's coming. You know, that we know what to prepare for, we know what to do. And like you said, that idea of training diaries, I'm a big fan of a training diary. It's such a simple thing. But, you know, like I will write everything down. I'm always writing to-do lists. I need to know what's coming so I can plan accordingly. So, you know, I'm sure a lot of handball athletes are quite busy. They've got stuff going on. So just make sure you get everything in that you need so that you're prepared for when you do eventually, you know, you're back playing games and stuff. And then training diaries to look back on what you've done as well is really important to kind of recognize progress that you've made. So yeah, I think no matter what, look, I'm not saying you need to have a structured routine that you need to know what you're doing for every day within half an hour increments, but just having an idea that, like, you know, my routine is that I always get my training done in the morning because I know that's when I'm most energetic, you know, especially at home at the moment when there's less structure, that I know I'll get the best training done and it sets me up for the day. Or actually, I just can't train in the morning. I need to get my work done and then I can look forward to training the evening. And that's my routine. You know, just having something that is that kind of consistent pattern within your week. It just gives you some kind of feeling of kind of comfort, knowing, having some idea of what's coming. And I think no matter what stage you're in, whether it's pandemic or not, knowing what you have coming is really, really important, being able to plan in advance, because if you haven't planned in advance, if anything goes wrong, then it's harder to cope with, usually, I find.
Yeah. And are the general principles of sports psychology the same for an individual sport as for a team sport? So obviously you were sprinting, you're an individual athlete. Our handballers that are watching this, or young people, are individual athletes for the most part. So what are the general things that differ, or is there anything that differs if you're going in to talk to a team rather than talk to an individual?
I suppose the biggest difference is the addition of the team dynamics. You know, so if you're working with an individual athlete, at the end of the day, the performance, you know, is down to them, whether it's on a track or on a pitch or whatever, you know, whatever. If they're an individual athlete, they kind of take sole responsibility for the performance once they go out onto that performance arena. Whereas on a pitch with the rest of your teammates, suddenly then there's team dynamics and you have to think about other people. Like for me, I only had to think about me in my lane. I didn't have to think about anyone else, or how anyone else's performance may impact on mine, or vice versa. So that's something that I took a bit of time to adjust to, was getting used to kind of the idea of the team dynamics and getting used to having all different personalities and opinions and thoughts coming together. So I think it can be a great thing as well, because the challenge of individual sports is that when it's going badly, there's no one else to turn to. Whereas when, you know, if maybe you can come in at half time and you have that little talk and pep each other up, there's none of that with an individual sport. You're kind of on your own. But then at the same time, if you're performing really well and the rest of the team isn't, I'm sure that's very frustrating. You're like, if this was me on my own, we'd be doing great. But these other ones are not performing as well as they could. So that's the biggest challenge. But like the general principles of, you know, setting goals, self-talk, relaxation techniques, imagery, those kind of general mental skills, they apply across the board to all athletes, because at the end of the day, psychology is what's going on in your head. So a lot of that will start with the individual, and then I kind of try to filter more of the team stuff to the team, depending on what that team's needs is.
And across the series of interviews that we've done, Jessie, one of the common themes that's coming from talking to our senior handballers and talking to Paul Brady as well, who's got a background in psychology, is resilience.
Yes.
It has come up almost independently of everyone else. People have said resilience is key, to, not alone in lockdown, but to make it to the top of the sport. And I'm sure you know that better than anyone. So aside, I know it's a little bit of a buzzword, but what does resilience mean to you, or how do you describe that word resilience when you're talking to the young athletes?
Yeah, look, I suppose the simplest definition of resilience is just that positive adaptation to challenge or setback. So it's basically how well you can cope with something going wrong and then being better as a result. So lockdown is a chance to get better, to develop some resilient skills to deal with what's been a year-long setback and come out of that better, in whether it's physically better, mentally kind of feeling a bit stronger. Whether it's coming back from an injury, like an injury will test your resilience because it is a setback. So can you see that as an opportunity to develop areas that you're weaker in, to use the time as an opportunity, or are you going to use the time as a time to just complain? So resilience is a skill, it's a skill that we develop. And it's a skill we have to kind of actively develop. So it's kind of in situations that are a challenge or a setback, it's kind of reflecting on them and seeing, how can I use this to make myself better? Or how can I learn from this, bad performance to make the next one better? If I'm in that situation again, how am I going to make sure that I've learned from that? And that's across the board, whether you're an athlete or not. But I think in sport, it's really important because there's so many more setbacks and disappointments and failures than there are the really, really good days. So there's probably more learning opportunities and opportunities to develop that resilience than there is the really good days that you don't do as much learning. So yeah, I think, if athletes can take that from this lockdown, what have I learned? What was really challenging from 2020 and how can I learn from that to make 2021 a little bit easier for myself? Maybe I didn't train as hard as I could have, but I'm going to make sure I train really hard so that I'm developing that resilience so that when I go back to training, I'm in the best position possible. This is a real test of our mental resilience, that training day in, day out with no real reward. This is testing our resilience as well. So yeah, look, it's a buzzword, but I think we all like it because it's a good buzzword. As buzzwords go, resilience is a good one because I think everyone can understand what it means to kind of come out fighting from a setback, or you get knocked down 8 times, you come up, you'd stand back up 9. It's that kind of idea.
And from interacting with like really top end sports people, yourself, your brother Thomas, who you mentioned, people, I'm sure you've interacted with loads of top end sports people. Aside from the obvious traits that we think of, is there anything else that's a common characteristic that you have noticed in these people, or is it basically just the obvious simple things are the secrets? Yeah,
it's a tough one because whether I have my psychologist hat on or not. One of the things I would say is that they enjoy it, which seems simple because you can apply that. But at the end of the day, you're training at that level. There is an inherent enjoyment of the sport, whether it's the sport itself or it's the competition element, or I've met some people who enjoy the pain of training. Strange enough as it seems, some people love to push themselves. So that's not across the board. I've met athletes who hate their sport and they're just doing it to get to the next goal. I lived with swimmers in the UK when I was doing a master's over there, and they hated swimming. It was just a case of, we just want to get to the next games and then we are done. So enjoyment is not across the board, but it definitely is what keeps, athletes in it longer, is that love.
Why did those swimmers keep going with it then?
I think because they'd set a goal for themselves. And I think probably, if I was to say actually what is probably the most common, is that driven, that drive, that kind of determination. So it's not motivation necessarily, because motivation comes and goes, but it's that I've set a goal and I'm going to achieve it, or I'm going to work as hard as I can to achieve it. So for them, it was, they wanted to go to the next games. I think it was, must have been the Rio games, because obviously this was after London. So I think Rio was the goal. So because they had set that for themselves, that's what they were going for. And what you see with athletes when they've achieved that goal and they haven't thought about the goal beyond that, might start to see that like that kind of settling down. And that happened for me as well. I was injured more often than not between London and Rio, and nothing stopped me thinking about the goal of Rio until literally the plane had flown and I wasn't on it. And I was like, okay, now I can stop thinking about Rio. And then it was very hard to refocus because I hadn't really thought beyond that. I wasn't really thinking of anything beyond that at that time. So yeah, it's that real kind of determined drive for a goal. And I think that's what's really important. And I just mentioned it earlier about that why are you doing it? You know, for some of these, it was to achieve this ultimate goal, whether it was to get to the games, it was to break a national record, it was to have to run on the Irish team. Those are the goals that are kind of, you know, it's having that really definite goal is probably the most common thing. Having something to aim for.
And just before we finish up, another comparison I'd like to draw and get your opinion on between your sport of athletics and our sport of handball. I watched the European indoors last week, and I'm a sports fan, and a lot of these athletes, you could see the shape they're in, the level they're competing at. But some of these athletes I hadn't heard of before. So yeah. The media exposure isn't there a lot of the time for athletics, only maybe every 4 years, like you talked about London and Rio. In handball, we have that issue maybe. Sometimes our players, I know how dedicated and how hard our elite athletes work in handball as well, but they're not going to get maybe the acclaim in the media. They mightn't get the sort of sponsorship opportunities and stuff like that maybe comes to other sports, like other GAA sports in particular. So is that something that is talked about much in athletics? I know, again, Jerry Kiernan used to talk about it, but how does it, let's say, what I'm trying to get at it is, let's say we have a young handballer who's considering maybe pursuing handball, but maybe there's brighter opportunities in other sports on those sort of tangential areas. But what would you say to a young person like that?
I suppose, again, I know I keep saying it, but the reason, like, why are you doing it? You know, if you're doing it because you want to get sponsorship and you want to get on telly, you're probably doing it for the wrong reasons. And it's interesting, you know, I know a lot of athletes who are asked to do, you know, public speaking events and stuff like that. And, you know, I would know Annalise Murphy, the sailor, quite well, or Niamh Briggs, the rugby player, you know, and these kind of people get asked to do, you know, talks, you know, to big companies. And the two girls pop into mind because both of them have said something similar, is that, like, I'm not a public speaker. I'm just good at the sport I do. Why does that make me a public speaker? And I think there's this assumption that, you know, I go into, you know, there's never an assumption when you start a sport that you're going to end up at this level. How many kids, you know, probably joined handball thinking, I'm going to be on TV week in, week out with loads of sponsorships? That's not it. It's maybe you're probably driven to, you know, put on an Irish vest or to play at the top level and be the best I can be. And then everything else is nearly secondary. It's a bonus. So, you know, most of those athletes you saw on the Irish team aren't sponsored. You know, they are names you're probably not going to hear of unless they qualify for Tokyo or they get onto another team. You're not going to hear about them on the day-to-day. So, sorry, the bin man is coming. The joys of working. Sorry if there's a bit of noise in the background. But yeah, I think just if I was to tell them, I said, look, if you love the sport, it shouldn't matter about you know, you're going to have a fan base of people who really love the sport. And they're the most important. It's the people who are interested, who know the sport, who know you. They're the fans you want. The rest are probably going to be the ones who are talking pretty negatively on Twitter, let's be honest, because they don't know much about it. So if you love the sport, it shouldn't really matter what extra attention. Don't get me wrong, it's frustrating when you're seeing, you know, maybe other athletes from other countries in the same sport getting more attention because maybe it's a bigger sport in their country, or athletes from in Ireland in different sports getting more attention because, like you said, the other GAA sports are so well covered and there's such good coverage. It is frustrating, don't get me wrong, because sometimes you're thinking, we train as hard, why are we getting the attention, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, that's not the reason I started. Or that's not the reason I'm sure these guys started. So if you can look past that and realize that those kind of things are a bonus, they don't mean a huge amount. Like, how many people go into sport in Ireland thinking, I'm going to be a professional athlete, this is going to be my job? It's often you fall into it and all these other things happen as a result. And some people don't want the things that happen as a result. They only want the sport bit. So yeah, It's an interesting one. It's a common enough thing because there is quite a gap between some sports and others, and it's quite obvious which are the popular sports, in terms of media coverage, and that is frustrating when you feel you're working as hard. But I suppose it's recognizing what the real rewards are. Those other things are just, they're external.
Jessie, we won't take up any more of your time. We've run over the time as it is. Thank you very much for sharing those insights. Absolutely fascinating listening to you, and the very best of luck with your PhD. And maybe we might get you in the handball court as well at some stage.
Oh God! I don't. No, I don't think you want to see that. I definitely don't have my eye coordination. But thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed that chat.
Thanks very much.